Okay, I hope we're all coming in loud and clear. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the second instalment of our online seminar series, What's Your Poison?, organised by the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces, and I trust you've all got a suitable intoxicant to hand. Today it's rum, and we're delighted to welcome our second speaker, Lila O'Leary Chambers. Lila's currently a final year PhD candidate in the Department of History at New York University, working on a wonderful thesis entitled Liquid Capital, Alcohol and the Rise of Slavery in the British Atlantic, 1623 to 1736. And the thesis explores how, as well as operating as an economic asset, the English used alcohol to subsume social and cultural barriers, maintain alliances, and establish the person-to-person diplomacy trade relations required. So before we get going, our usual spot of housekeeping. Lila will speak for around half an hour, and then there will be around half an hour for questions and discussion. There is a little chat feature at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen where you're very welcome to post constructive comments and observations throughout the talk. However, if you have a question for Lila, please post it using the separate Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can sort of post these as they occur to you throughout the talk, or save them until the Q&A. If you want me to ask the question on your behalf, simply type it out and I'll ventriloquize you. If you'd rather ask it yourself, just type question or similar into the box and I'll try and invite you up onto the screen, although do be aware the event is being recorded. So without further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to turn things over to Lila and rum and the politicisation of space in the Leeward Islands, 1624 to 1736.
Hello, everyone, and I want to start by thanking James for inviting me, organizing this for everyone, and taking care of the tech, which I'm glad that I do not have to do. I just wanted to give a brief warning that the internet in New York City is very bad universally, so it's possible that it might drop out, but I will be back if that happens, so do not panic. So I'm going to just start by sharing my screen, and then we will get going. Okay. Fortunately, I have to read the paper off of the computer as well because I don't have a printer. So I don't know the best. All right, I'll just bring the images up when necessary. Sorry about that. So on April 29th, 1675, John Hilton, a storekeeper and chief gunner on Nevis, offered the island's General Assembly his allegedly first-hand account of the founding of the neighboring island of St. Christopher. It began with Captain Thomas Warner's initial failure to establish a colony at Guiana, which drove him to make a fresh start at St. Christopher in 1623. After Warner established a cordial relationship with the leader of the Kalinago there, Tegramente, he planted tobacco and created a fort and palisade. 2 years after cohabitation, Warner received a report from Barb, an indigenous woman he believed to be enslaved by the Kalinago, that Tegramente and his allies planned on attacking the English settlement. In her advice to Warner, Barb detailed that, quote, "The king and the rest laid there a drinking as is their custom, to make a drinking 3 or 4 days, and is to be drunken before they go upon their designs." Warner acted immediately, gathering support from the French nearby. In Hilton's words, "Like a wise man and a good soldier, he took advantage of their being drunk and fell upon them in the night and did kill and slay a great many amongst them." Tegramente died in his hammock, along with over 100 of his men, women, and children, run through by an English rapier. By 1629, the English and French had killed, enslaved, or run off the remaining Kalinago and divided the island amongst themselves. As a reward for his quick thinking, fortitude, and brutality, the crown awarded Thomas Warner the governorship of St. Christopher, celebrating him for, quote, "much advancing his majesty's sovereignty and power in those parts, and with it the true religion, laws, civility, navigation, and trade of his kingdom of England for the eternal glory and comfort of the same." As this narrative suggests, both the Kalinago and English settlers relied on the strategic use of alcohol to assert their own models of authority over the Leeward Islands. Barb's warning further reveals that the shared consumption of intoxicating drink, rum or indigenous-produced wiku, was a cornerstone of political and military decision-making in Kalinago communities. As I hope this paper will demonstrate, the Kalinago consumed alcohol to create the conditions that made political practice possible within their structures of alliance, geographical dispersal, and cosmologies of warfare. Ritualized intoxication transformed quotidian spaces, community structures, seafaring vessels, open terrain, into nodes of diplomatic and military strategy. While historians have tended to follow the 18th century English merchant Captain Thomas Waldeck's assertion that the first thing the English do, be it in the most remote parts of the world or amongst the most barbarous Indians, is to set up a tavern or drinking house, as reflecting a lack of other, more decorous institutions of governance. I instead argue that alcohol and the spaces and relationships created around it in the Leeward Islands formed and reformed models of control and authority. And in fact, the Kalinago had already set up their own drinking houses. Such houses and the consumption that occurred within them formed the center of an elastic and enduring set of political practices that held together a geographically diffuse community of men, women, and children spread throughout the Antilles. Because Kalinago conceptions of political authority and territorial access were not predicated on continuously occupying particular islands, the bonds created through the shared rituals of alcohol consumption held all the more importance. European settlers' ultimate efforts to cast them as frivolous consumers therefore fit squarely within the larger process of territorial dispossession. Despite the difficulty of reading along the bias strain and past European efforts to cast them as barbarous, attentiveness to the instances of alcohol consumption offers new insights into Kalinago diplomacy, military strategy, gender politics, and resistance in the hopes of working against what Melanie Newton has termed the narrative of Aboriginal disappearance in the Anglo-Caribbean. Both preceding and following the violent expulsion of Tegramente's people from St. Christopher, English and Irish settlers in the Leeward Islands also seized on alcohol as a diplomatic intermediary with the potential to be mobilized and indeed weaponized against their competitors, namely the Kalinago in the front. They also counted it as an integral component of the financial infrastructure that supported their presence on the island. Though I don't have time to get into the details of it today, in addition to facilitating political and personal affiliation, to see, for example, the Daniel Park incident, the funds generated from taxing alcohol allowed colonial officials to put aside space in a different way, through the construction of forts like Monk's Hill in Falmouth, Antigua, a far more permanent claim of sovereignty than the wooden palisade Tegramente initially objected to in St. Christopher's. Although not named in Hilton's founding narrative, enslaved and free Africans would come to make up the majority of the Leeward's Island population by the mid-18th century. Ripped from their ancestral lands or born into slavery in the Caribbean, enslaved and free Africans hailing largely from the Gold Coast lived within a different set of restrictions and political frameworks than the Kalinago. Nevertheless, they also drank rum together to create covert spaces of political connection and community, despite their enslavement, and indeed the legal controls on their imbibing. As with the Kalinago, the extant archive is generally uninterested in what enslaved people thought or hoped to achieve by consuming alcohol, beyond casting them as morally unfit and racialized subjects. Enslaved people nonetheless made themselves known. I'm going to end today with a short discussion of the most prominent instance of political rum drinking in the Leeward Islands, the 1736 conspiracy and subsequent trials. Despite at times radically different traditions of political practice, resources, positionalities, and power, all three groups, Kalinago, African and African descended, and British, created a political infrastructure through the shared consumption of rum. There's much to be said about how English and Irish settlers caught politics along with their rum, but for today's purposes, I'm going to focus on the less appreciated shapers of political life in the Leeward Islands, the Kalinago and the enslaved. While the English takeover of St. Christopher stands as a particularly consequential event with far-reaching ramifications for both the English and the native people they displaced, alcohol constituted an important component of Anglo-Kalinago encounter and diplomatic interaction from the beginning. Similar to Warner's landing on St. Christopher 20 years later, John Nichols and the crew of the Olive shipwrecked on St. Lucia after a failed excursion to Guyana in 1607. However, unlike Tegramente's people, the Kalinago on St. Lucia did not miss the opportunity to turn intoxicants into an opportunity to reassert their control. After initially bartering for provisions, John Nichols stated that, "We took them all into our houses and were very merry and pleasant with them, and gave them aquavitae, which they much delighted in. While one sailor, quote, fell a singing of causes with the Caribbees and caused them to drink carouses of aquavit and water." Nichols also noted that coming together through drink in the intimacy of the Kalinago home presented an opportunity for violence if the English had chosen to take it. The drinking party instead broke out with the Kalinago leading a contingent of the English to visit another settlement. Once there, the English were ambushed. Only Nichols survived to warn the remaining crew members left at the camp. They surrendered to the Kalinago, who granted them leave to take a small boat off the island. Nichols' message to his reading audience was clear. By not taking the opportunity for violence shared and by being presented, the English directly suffered the, quote, lamentable stratagems of the Kalinago, which resulted in, quote, the utter ruin and butcherly murderings of our own selves. Beyond the social, alcohol formed a central component of Kalinago diplomacy and military strategy. While difficult to assess because of the paucity of extant Kalinago accounts from the period, European observers provide some insight into why the Kalinago viewed alcohol not only as an item of trade, but as an integral component of politics and warfare. In fact, most popular English language publications asserted that the Kalinago confined their drinking only to political and diplomatic occasions, with little room for casual or social inebriation. In his edition of the History of the Caribbean Islands, John Davies, for example, insisted that in all their ordinary repasts, their sobriety and cleanliness is so observable as can hardly be imagined among savages. John Oldmixon echoed the second sentiment in a more negative tone, claiming that political meetings and war councils aside, the Kalinago behaved far better than the Brazilians around alcohol, who, in their debauches, drank 3 or 4 days without ceasing, and in their drunkenness engaged themselves in all kinds of vices. Formed of smaller communities spread amongst the small islands dotting the Antilles and the South American mainland, the Kalinago nonetheless came together in large gatherings of captains or military leaders and their supporters to welcome diplomatic or trading parties, make internal political decisions, and launch military expeditions, all of which involved the shared consumption of alcohol. Wiku, a fermented drink made from cassava and water and produced by women, constituted the main Kalinago intoxicant. Later, rum could be used in place of or alongside wiku. Offering and receiving alcohol formed a crucial bridge between potential trading partners, visitors or allies, and the resident Kalinago group. Women continued to play a significant role in the management of wiku during rituals of hospitality. Breton's Dictionnaire Français Caribe reinforces this association, including the phrase "Quelle fasse de wiku avant que nous venions," which translates to "she makes the wiku," as an expression indicating before our arrival in the Kalinago language. Kalinago material culture further illustrated their communal drinking practices. Missionary Raymond Breton describes the 2 largest earthen vessels they produced, a chamiko and a tulawa, as holding 20 to 30 pots of wiku, depending on the size of the gathering. He also defines cheba, or pass, as a phrase used at feast regarding the serving of wiku out of 12 to 15 vessels, similar in size to a wine barrel. Correspondingly, the Kalinago expression, "Hilauku amuke," draw me some wiku, reflected the use of calabashes made into a drinking cup that was held by one handle at the base and dipped into a larger container, rather than pouring individual glasses as Breton detailed for European consumers. Once the visitors or local community had been assembled and plied with the appropriate amount of drink, the true work of settling diplomatic matters, significant occasions, or commencing internal political congress could begin. Missionary de la Borde stated the general consensus amongst European observers most simply. They never go to war without first having a great drinking party, and it is there that they hold council, that they resolve and conclude all the affairs of state. While not fully cognizant of the cosmology underlying these occasions, it's clear that these authors recognize that Kalinago communities consumed significant amounts of alcohol as a political act that facilitated diplomatic and military action. How English colonizers deployed or disregarded that information shaped the relationship between the groups in ways that had sustained consequences. Because the alcohol they produced and served formed such a significant portion of these political proceedings, women framed them in a material way. And in fact, in Davies' rendition at least, after the captain declared the plan to meet, concrete preparations began only once women started concocting an especially potent drink, quote, more apt to intoxicate. In addition to producing wiku or other intoxicants that fueled ritualized decision-making, Kalinago women also participated directly. According to Davies, once those assembled started to have their brains warmed with their drink, an old woman comes into the assembly with a sad countenance and deportment, and with tears in her eyes demands audience. which being easily granted her by reason of the respect and reverence they bear her age. The women would then recite injuries, grievances, and a rationale for warfare against the offending party, which the captain would then repeat and elaborate on. The rest of the community would either express approval or divert plans for attack. Davies concludes by underscoring the importance of proper inebriation for this process, for they take these bloody resolutions when they are well loaded with drink, and after the devil hath tormented them to egg them on thereto, as we have said elsewhere. In some ways, the inclusion of women in the process of waging war or deciding peace complicated English assertions of the predations or abuses of Kalinago men and women on women in their social orbit. While some European authors viewed women's presence in carebat houses as indicative of the ameliorative influence of European civility, more than likely it reflected long-standing Kalinago practice, in which women played a crucial political role through supplying the wiku necessary to facilitate effective decision-making, as well as act as a living dossier of diplomatic information. British colonial administrators' failure to recognize women's role in facilitating and participating in Kalinago politics transformed women from embedded political figures capable of engaging in the project of asserting Indigenous sovereignty into laborers, divorced from a larger social and cultural structures. As Audra Simpson has illustrated, this death drive to eliminate, contain, hide, and in other ways disappear what fundamentally challenges its legitimacy. Indigenous political orders stood as a common technique of asserting Euro-American sovereignty over Indigenous space. Women's contributions themselves were and are particularly vulnerable to assault. Under slavery, the alcohol Indigenous women produced no longer powered military strategy or community debate. Instead, it became another consumable fed into the maws of English and Irish settlers. European authors repeatedly commented that the relationship between political or military caucuses and drinking was so strong amongst Kalinago that they used the same term for alcohols and political gatherings. De La Borde, for example, insisted to hold a carbet, have a drinking party, and hold council are, in their view, equivalent synonyms, the one never being done without the other. Old Mixon disseminated this particular linguistic connection in English, alleging that the Kalinago call these assemblies wiku. Perhaps indicative of both trading networks and English suspicions of their imperial rivals, Old Mixon further underlined the responsive relationship between drinking and politics, adding, and since they had conversed with the French, vin, that wine had entered the lexicon as the same name for a political event. English colonizers at times tried to appeal to Kalinago use of alcohol in political relationships, particularly when under threat from their French rivals in the region, which was almost always. In his report on the state of the Leeward Islands sent to the Lords of Trade and Plantation in July 1668, Governor William Willoughby of Barbados detailed their recent acquisition of Dominica and outlined a plan for treating with the island's Kalinago residents in the wake of, quote, concluding a peace with the Indians March past. After labeling them, quote, turbulent and active, even after he appointed the, quote, Mestiche Thomas Warner, deputy governor, he suggested that the Kalinago were vulnerable to French influence, ready to be stirred up against the English at a moment's notice. To prevent such dangerous associations, he urged that they keep some English among them to put them upon some warlike design against some other nation on the main, following the logic that the Kalinago desire for warfare can be sated through combat with a neutral enemy rather than the English. To facilitate this plan, he explained, we must furnish them with toys and strong liquors for a while, for which, and for some of their periagos, he explains Indian boats, for which there is a great necessity at Antigua, he must put his majesties to some expense. Dispensing alcohol in this way accomplished two things. While it might cost the crown money initially, Willoughby's offer of gifts of strong drink could afford them a political edge in their efforts to keep the Kalinago from siding with the French or resuming their piecemeal attacks against the Leeward Islands. With Kalinago rituals of warfare in mind, Willoughby's insistence on including alcohol takes on a further dimension. By providing the alcohol necessary to conduct Kalinago war councils, Willoughby further increased the likelihood that his plan to direct martial assaults away from the English might transpire. Even when used to build, or at least manage, a positive relationship with the Kalinago, however, violence threatened below the surfaces of all instances of shared imbibing. In the fractured society of the early Leeward Islands, coming to any sort of coherent policy between each of the islands, or indeed in different individuals within a single island, proved a difficult task. English actions and attitudes towards the Kalinago proved no different. While some, like Willoughby and Jonathan Atkins, another governor of Barbados, urged anonymity with those savages, the contrary having always been pernicious to the smaller Leeward Islands, individual or local interests often outweighed in the declared policy. In fact, disagreement over the proper handling of Kalinago relations contributed to the political restructurings of the Leeward Islands as its own governing body, distinct of that from Barbados. In a proposal put forth by the planters and merchants of Nevis and the other islands, concerns over Indian raids featured centrally, leading the Nevians to argue that they needed their own military and means of funding it. For unless there be soldiers to plant and keep guards, the Indians will perpetually annoy and destroy them. As the 17th century wore on, violence outweighed any sense of accommodation. Rather than violence without logic, however, centering alcohol as a medium for political communication casts some of the more infamous Anglo and Kalinago interactions in a new light and places them in the longer trajectory of negotiations over authority and sovereignty within the islands. So one of the most famous is the murder of Thomas Warner by his brother, his half-brother, Philip Warner, which is very convoluted and I'm not going to get into today. But essentially, Philip Warner lured his brother, the then governor of Dominica, to celebrate a martial victory, supplied rum, and then ended up killing his brother and his supporters. Philip Warner then faced trial, but ultimately was let off. So after repeated smaller Kalinago raids against Antigua, a Kalinago attack on Barbuda acted as a catalyst for the official policy of the Leeward Islands becoming one of explicit genocide. As in the infamous murder of Thomas Warner, exploiting Kalinago consumption for political ends played a key role. As Governor William Stapleton reported it, on the afternoon of July 4th, 1681, a group of 40 Kalinago landed on the small island of Barbuda and approached a house, wherein were only 3 men, 2 women, and 2 children. After silently slaying one man, chopping wood with a poisoned arrow, a smaller group of Kalinago men approached the house and, quote, pretended as is their custom most treacherous, they come in friendship, and demanded drink, which was then given them through a window. While they drank, one of the Englishmen insisted to an English-speaking Kalinago man, Captain Peter, that they prove their friendship by reviving the poisoned man. Instead, Captain Peter wielded his axe against him. Both Captain Peter and the Christian man exchanged shots, but then returned to parleying. This respite in violence lasted only briefly. 2 women and 2 children tried to escape while, quote, the Indians were drinking kill devil or rum, this country spirit, and pillaging the house, but were caught short and killed. All told, 8 English settlers and 3 Kalinago died in the altercation, including Captain Peter. Stapleton relayed this account to buttress his subsequent award against the Kalinago, despite factions of the Caribbean colonial administration and at times the Crown urging for friendlier relations. However, it also hints at a hidden set of interactions. If shared imbibing of English-supplied alcohol truly only occurred followed by immediate massacre, it's unlikely there would be much of a guise of friendship, as Stapleton described at all. Furthermore, the episode also reaffirms the close relationship between Kalinago assertions of sovereignty and alcohol consumption, even if it does not precisely map onto the pattern of carbonic consumption prior to attack or a celebratory drink afterwards. Finally, Captain Peter and his associates demanding and accepting of rum offers another example of Kalinago flexibility around which alcohol could be used to open relations. Within their own communities, it might be wiku, with the French, wine or brandy were likely the norm, and with the English, rum. In response to the attack on Barbuda, Governor William Stapleton cried for, quote, revenge for the blood of my fellow subjects, and urged the lords of trade to support his plan to, quote, destroy those heathens, or if he could not compass their total destruction, at least make them fly to the main. Describing the atmosphere in the Leeward Islands as living with a perpetual fear of a skulking enemy which comes in the night or at any hour like a thief or a robber, Stapleton went on to raid several Kalinago settlements, sinking 46 large periagos and crenons, killing and injuring an unspecified number of warriors and civilians, and burning 300, quote, pitiful little day houses. Terming this expedition Indian hunting, he especially emphasized destroying, quote, one of their war and carousing houses, which he measured standing at 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. Stapleton's description belies a greater understanding of Kalinago politics and warfare than has previously been credited to the English. Attacking an enemy's structure implicated in the process of war-making is perhaps an obvious choice. However, Stapleton's further description of it as a carousing house underscores his recognition of the close relationship between communal drinking and political practice for Kalinago communities. Stapleton did not succeed in his ambition to exterminate the Kalinago, leaving his successors to plan for potential attacks and soothe worried planters. While the Kalinago continued to harry the British colonies and to continue to this day to demand more from the post-colonial government of Dominica, in the first 3 decades of the 18th century, West African political practice became one of the primary concerns of the colonial administrators and the growing planter class. Enslaved people were not supposed to have politics, and they were simply supposed to provide labor, physical and reproductive, and aid in growing the wealth of those that claimed ownership over them. However, following instances of rum consumption in the mass of documentation generated by the 1736 conspiracy trials reveals the extent to which, first, enslaved and free Africans continued to make space for what I'm calling rival political geographies, even if they were not legally counted as persons. And second, that British observers recognized and indeed feared the seriousness of their political intent, in no small part because of their sometimes murky understanding of the importance of oath drinking and communal consumption. For today's purposes, I'm not going to delve too deeply into the intricacies of the 1736 plot. David Barry Gaspar's Bondmen and Rebels does an excellent job of tracing the sort of ins and outs of how it developed. But essentially, in case you're not familiar with it, an island group of enslaved men and women, both saltwater and island born, led by Court and then Tomboy and Secundi, agreed to, quote, execute a plot whereby all the white inhabitants of the island were to be murdered and a new form of government established by the slaves amongst themselves. 132 enslaved people were convicted, 88 were executed, and 32 banished. The investigation only stopped when the island's planters reached a point of emotional and financial fatigue. Fitting to the present purposes of this paper, quite a few of the complaints about the expense of prosecuting the conspiracy related to the need to keep soldiers, watchmen, and jailers properly warmed with rum. In a series of trials, questionings, executions, and council speeches in which few facts could be agreed upon, one of the most remarkably consistent aspects of the conspiracy, as related by both colonial officials and enslaved witnesses, were instances of ritualized drinking. Quote, some Swiss feasts, such as the one held by Tomboy in 1735, snatched drinks behind sheds or small gatherings concluded with a swig of rum, are all invoked as moments where enslaved people came together to affirm their commitment to overthrowing the conditions of their bondage and remind each other of the new political order they hoped to build. Termed an oath draft in much of the testimony, those involved with the conspiracy swore a version of the following. Here is confusion and damnation to all of those that would confess or be false, and that will not stand by and help kill or destroy the white people, man, woman, and child. This is said once for all, because for the future we shall not repeat the words of this oath when it is mentioned. As the damnation and confusion component of the oath illustrates, rum consumed in these circumstances could also act as a reminder of the costs of failure. Much like the concept of drinking fetish within West African and Khan-speaking belief systems that I've explored in my larger thesis, those that betrayed their co-imbibers risked the fitting punishment of confusion, or in other terms, social alienation, if they were to betray their fellow conspirators. So I'm going to focus on one vividly described instance of imbibing in this context. Abba's feast provides one of the most vivid illustrations of the ways that enslaved people on Antigua drew on rum, a substance typically thought of as a waste product of the plantation labor they were forced to provide, to imagine possible futures outside of slavery. Held in honor of Abba's recently deceased sister, a whole rash of conspirators swore to the cause through taking the damnation oath over wine, beer, and rum punch, depending on what the drinker preferred. Unlike many of the other gatherings where this oath was taken, Abba was explicitly acknowledged as the maker of the feast and directly participated in creating spaces where plans to overthrow the plantocracy could flourish. Another key element of this particular feast was the inclusion of grave dirt that, quote, Abba herself fetched from her sister's grave. A man named Dick recounted that Abba's sister's grave dirt traveled with a man named Wadi to his house as well. He invited Dick to swear by saying, "Won't you drink? You are no strangers." That drank out of a bowl, and then drank out of a bowl with punch that was muddy, and Kuja drank then out of the same bowl. External components like Abba's sister's grave dirt or cock's blood were not requirements. When asked specifically by interrogators, Dick and Jemmy attested that punch or common wine bound them equally as well. However, the additional items stirred in heightened the consequences of turning against this shadow political system. Although not all of the alleged conspirators claimed Gold Coast extraction, many of them did. Others had been enslaved in English or Spanish colonies for much, if not all, of their lives. The resonances with fetish practices or drinking friends ceremonies of the Khan-speaking people is clear, as are the resonances with European health drinking. The addition of Abba's sister's grave dirt offered a concrete grounding in the Caribbean. Speaking to both traditions, but forging a third, the conspirators used shared and ritualized consumption of rum to make political claims on the land they occupied and on each other. Colonial officials took oath drafts seriously. As much as they expressed distaste at the use of grave dirt or the sly way the meetings came about, they nonetheless acknowledged that enslaved men and women were enacting a rival form of politics to the ones that placed them as slaveholders and assemblymen. And in fact, the most likely road of being convicted for direct involvement in the conspiracy was having witnesses attest that they saw the accused person taking the oath draft or drinking in the company of those that did. In a closing speech on the perfidy of the conspirators and the need to complete the many executions the court ordered, one official blamed, quote, entertainments of dancing, gaming, and feasting, where they were debauched with liquor in their minds, embittered against their masters and against the condition of slavery. Though he blamed liquor for debauching them, he also understood that enslaved communities viewed oath drafts of rum and other substances as a political catalyst that could threaten the foundations of the Leeward Islands slaveholding society. Taking Kalinago and enslaved use of alcohol to create space for and spaces of politics is an equally central framework to read the early archive of English settler colonialism offers new insight into how these competing claims of authority were contested into the 18th century. With that in mind, I'm going to end this paper by returning to the beginning, with the death of Tegramente and most of his people that made possible the birth of St. Christopher, and the battles over authority between those that survived and the settler colonial project that sought to foreclose their survival. So unfortunately, this is where I need the map. I'm going to try sharing my screen again. Okay, so here is the, so I'm just going to have to, unfortunately, have to show it this way. So this, I'm going to end by talking about this map, which comes from the estate of another Leeward Islands Governor William Matthew, and it's held actually in Cardiff, of all places. And so this map was made for Governor William Matthew in 1730, and it offers an ornamented depiction of the outbuildings, fields, and natural features that made up his plantation. Invoking the island's history as well as its present and ideally lucrative future, conveys a visual narrative as well as an alleged reality of spatial organization. Dedicated to the governor and schematically organized, it suggests a steadfast completion of the productive settler colonial project, decorated at the perimeter with the most recognizable icon of the island's past, the indigenous person lounging in hammock. A surface level reading suggests that the British have completed the project of securing the island, producing sugar and rum to profit, Crown Colony, and themselves. However, read more carefully, the space of the Leeward Islands takes on different layers of political meaning. In H, which is the main house, and attendant buildings, the enslaved quarters, pastures, and woods likely hid enslaved and free Africans, swearing allegiance to each other and imagining political futures over stolen swallows of rum. Reading the map in the context of the longer history of Kalinago-Ango interaction also shifts our understanding of the hammocked figure. Rather than a fanciful trooper, the figure is designed to reference the colonial origin story, in which an inebriated Kalinago man, a captain, was murdered while he slept based on informed assumptions about Kalinago political practice involving alcohol. Placed at the top center, the presence of this figure reframes the entire plantation process. His machete dangling over English efforts at ordered control of the Caribbean, an indigenous sword of Damocles serving as an important reminder of the fragility and violence on which their presence in the Leeward Islands depended. While the English ultimately succeeded in asserting sovereignty over the Leeward Islands, the lounging indigenous figure nonetheless reinforces that this process was repeatedly contested, one through negotiations with, but more commonly violence towards, the Kalinago and enslaved Africans, in which the politics of alcohol played no small role. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lila, for that perfectly timed, wonderfully spatial and fascinating exploration of the role of rum in the resistance strategies of enslaved people. Because you were so perfectly timed, we've got 25 minutes for questions. So if anyone has anything, do pop it in the Ask a Question box. In the meantime, I'll use Chair's privilege. Obviously, sort of rum is a byproduct of the production of another, what we consider to be an intoxicant in this period, which is sugar. And obviously a massive sort of question. But can you perhaps sort of say a little bit more about the relationship between rum and sugar, and how that might sort of figure within your analysis?
I can. So one of the the most obvious way would be that often it could be straight rum being consumed, but often it would be punch. So sugar is obviously involved in that, sugar and lime. But less directly, one of the things that I found interesting about thinking about the relationship between enslaved people and rum in the Caribbean and sugar is that while it is thought of as a waste product, the management of plantations often does depend on having rum be produced. So in terms of offering rum to enslaved people in prescribed instances, such as at Christmas or other kind of holidays, that was kind of a method of control that planters could use to sort of release the pressure valve and have some control over the sort of social world of enslaved people. The other thing is that in terms of the management of plantation finances, if it was a bad sugar year, rum would kind of be used to close the gap. They might be able to trade it for other materials or be able to sell rum or molasses in situations where either there was less sugar or the sugar was of a pretty poor quality that year. So it does matter to the finances in a way that I think often gets overshadowed by the focus on sugar. But I also think that they were rarely trying to make rum, they were trying to make sugar. And rum was kind of the fallback option, even though they did require it for the management of their plantation populations.
Wonderful, thank you, Lila. We have a question here from Anna, who's asked for the spellings of the native people and the native drink. So I wonder if you can. So encourage Anna with that one.
So the name of the indigenous population is Kalinago, so it's spelled Kalinago. And you would often see that in older scholarship referred to as Carib. The Kalinago themselves today prefer the term Kalinago because of the associations with cannibalism that Carib holds. So if you're interested in reading more, it might be under Carib, but I use Kalinago. And then the intoxicant that they produce, Wiku, is spelled Ouicou.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope that answers your question. Anna, question from our own Dagmar Freist. Would you say that there was a bias against ritualized drinking, depending on who was drinking and where?
Yes, absolutely. And it becomes, over the course of the sort of 17th into the 18th centuries, it becomes increasingly racialized. I didn't talk about it in this paper, but with the Kalinago, it becomes increasingly associated with, rather than sort of military prowess, it becomes associated with sort of drunken laziness, which initially they kind of think of it, okay, they get drunk and then they go and attack, and it's this very ferocious thing. But that kind of transforms as the Kalinago are removed from the Leeward Islands. It also gets associated, I didn't show these images, but it can be associated with cannibalism. So there you see a few woodcuts of people making riku and then somebody, you know, cutting up a person in the background. There isn't really, I mean, this is a huge debate, but there's no real component in any of the descriptions that I see about the island Kalinago of cannibalism. But there is kind of this idea that unbridled and sort of immoral consumption goes together. So this disordered consumption of alcohol with this disordered consumption by eating human flesh. And then for the enslaved people, it's a similar thing where it's taking what is a kind of routine instance, which would be in English frameworks, which is drinking healths and toasting and drinking rum punch in a communal setting, all of which they do, and all of which are important to their political processes in the Caribbean, perhaps more so than in the metropole. And because it's done by enslaved Africans, it takes on this sinister edge. And so there's an idea about, increasingly a racialized idea about who is fit to consume in this way, and sort of who can drink communally and in ritualized fashions in a way that is containable, and who can't. Which is all the more ironic because, as I alluded to, one of the governors of the Leeward Islands, Daniel Park, was actually murdered by the Leeward Islands planters, and partially that was plotted over drinking together. So it's kind of a lack of understanding of how it's both a dismissal of their own practices, and I think kind of a discomfort with seeing what they often engaged in reflected back to them through the practices of the conspirators.
Wonderful, thank you, Lila. And it's a two-parter. There's a second part to Dagmar's question, which is your focus was very much on the ritualized aspects of drinking. Can you say anything about the intoxicating aspects of drinking? I mean, it's quite sort of common within the field, isn't it? You talk about all these various social and political and cultural attributes, but at the heart of it, you know, people are actually getting drunk. And how does sort of the state of intoxication itself feature in this narrative?
Mm-hmm. So for the Kalinago, the intoxication wasn't part of the ritual. They're not drinking a small amount. They are drinking to get drunk. That's the point. There's a period of sort of, it's stretched over 3 or 4 days often, or at least a longer period. So it's not binge drinking and suddenly you're drunk, but it is, the point of the ritual is to get to a state of intoxication that allows for a different kind of decision making, a different kind of method of interacting with one another. For the enslaved populations that I'm looking at in this conspiracy and otherwise, there's instances of intoxication, often around dancing beforehand, that these rituals do accompany actual feasts that are social and cultural gatherings. But I do get the sense, there's a few instances where people the witnesses describe being too drunk and having to sort of hide the fact that they're drunk when they're going home, so that their masters don't realize. But I think there is a limit placed on how intoxicated they can actually get because of the worry of sort of being exposed or any other kind of risk that they might be taking. So there are very few instances of people actually describing feeling drunk in what I look at, but for the enslaved population. For the Kalinago, again, feeling drunk is kind of the point, especially because there isn't, as I said, there isn't really a social point where people drink to excess. that doesn't really happen. It's only in these sort of political and military contexts.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers your questions, Dagmar. Moving on, we have one from Phil here. He says it's usual to speak of alcohol as a lubricant of social and political relations in this period, but your talk suggests it may even have been constitutive and causal, in that things actually happen because of it. He wants to clarify, is that your argument? And he sort of rather playfully suggests a counterfactual at the end. What would happen in the region if there hadn't been alcohol?
If there hadn't been alcohol, I wouldn't have a dissertation. But more seriously, I do think that for the Kalinago, there is within their own framework the idea that this shared production by women together of wiku and then the shared consumption makes it possible for them to have these sorts of conversations and over warfare and diplomatic decision making. So I wouldn't say necessarily that alcohol as a material item makes these things happen. However, I do think that within their own sort of political frameworks, it's seen as the same thing as I don't know, wearing wigs and having a gavel in order for there to be legal decisions made in the British context, right? Like it's a necessary both material item and it's a necessary means to an end in terms of being intoxicated to make decisions. For enslaved people, I do think that there's a mutability to the way that oaths can be made that I guess if alcohol wasn't present, I think that there would still be the possibility of conspiracy and political upheaval. However, given the way that Akan-speaking people, and to some extent creolized enslaved people, viewed the seriousness of taking an oath over sharing a drink, I think that is sort of what gave people the security in something as risky as planning a conspiracy, that this sort of binding aspect of the shared drink was important. And I'm sure that, there's a few instances where it's just so fascinating, the degree of preference that's recorded in these court trials where there's a few men that just say they don't really like alcohol that much. They prefer not to drink it. And for one of them, they put it in some juice for him so that he can still do it, which I thought was very sensitive to somebody that didn't want to drink. And they don't say why he didn't want to drink. It could be that he was Muslim or something like that, where his religion precluded it. But overall, I think it is not causal, but very, in some cases, causal for the Kalinago. I think at the end of the day, though, it was, I don't know how, it's difficult to imagine the Caribbean without rum or some other type of alcohol.
Wonderful, thank you, Lila. Phil, I hope that was helpful. Next up, I've got a question from Gabriel Gurian. Thank you, Gabriel. He says, given the importance of alcohol for medical practices of the period and the usual necessities of the adaptation of techniques and resources in the colonies, how often was rum used in medical circumstances in the British Atlantic?
That's a great question, and the answer is all the time. I think I talk about this more on slaving ships and in West Africa, where it's rum, but it's often brandy or fortified wines are kind of used as the first and last call of port for, that was not a pun, not actual port, port of call for medical treatment. So everything from washing out wounds to clear fevers, dropsy, different pustules and boils that are kind of doused with brandy or rum. One of the more, it's also within the context of the slave trade becomes, again, distinguished along lines of race. So one so-called Guinea surgeon talks about how the only way he can get enslaved people on ships to take certain other types of medical treatment was to give them a dram of rum he has some kind of quote that I'm not going to repeat verbatim, but about how it convinces, they're like children, and then that convinces them to take other medicine. And so they love liquor. So just basically give them that and they'll accept other forms of treatment. In the Caribbean, there's a contest over whether or not rum improves or helps your health. So Karen Kupperman, Katherine Johnston have articles about this, that this idea of humoral balance in the early Caribbean is important, but then kind of fades out a bit across the 18th century. So it is important, but they are always somewhat dubious about how effective it actually is.
Wonderful, thank you, Lila. Gabrielle, I hope that answered your question. Next up, we have one from Lauren Working. Thank you, Lauren, who asks, are there differences in the social, political, and intoxicating function of rum among the enslaved in the Leeward Islands and other colonial or invaded spaces, such as Virginia or parts of Africa?
I do think that there are, in the sense that the ethnic, if we can call it that, makeup, or where people have been brought from in the Caribbean is variable. So, for example, I mean, this is all constructed partially by the enslavers, but in the court records, there's a lot of discussion about how many of the people involved in the Antiguan conspiracy are Coromantee. Sorry, you can't see my quotes. Coromantee, and so that means coming from the Gold Coast, which is suggests a more similar set of shared experiences and cultural background through a con speaker, because they're all con speakers, although there are obviously differences. That is different depending on where you are and the trade routes involved. Obviously, European attention to African political affiliation is not always that strong, so take those depictions with a grain of salt. But I do think that you see a different relationship because of that. And I also think that in the case of the Caribbean, and perhaps in the mainland colonies that border Spanish territory, you'll see more of a Catholic influence in the way that rituals are understood. So some of the people involved in the Antiguan conspiracy, a small handful, are described as Portuguese enslaved people, that some of which are Catholic. And I think obviously Catholics have a different relationship to ritualized alcohol consumption, and I think that influences the way that rituals are understood.
Brilliant, thank you, Lila. I hope that was helpful, Lauren. Next up, we've got a question from Michael Bennett, apologies, who says, historians such as Richard Dunn present the islands of the early 17th century English Caribbean as frontier societies with lots of consistently drunk and rowdy colonists and planters. Does this fit with your understanding of these colonial societies, or is it perhaps overstated?
That's a great question, because that's one of my chapters, but no, that doesn't fit. So I do think that alcohol is very important. So I didn't really talk about planter society that much in this paper, because as I was writing it, I realized 30 minutes was actually not very much time to talk. So alcohol was tremendously important to English and Irish settlers as well. But the ways in which they used alcohol were also much more politically and socially regulated and invested than I think early scholarship on the Caribbean suggests. I think that a lot of the sort of Dunn-esque, I mean, while I enormously groundbreaking scholarship and I couldn't be doing what I'm doing without his work, I think there's a tendency to buy into the sort of 19th century idea, late 18th, early 19th century idea of Caribbean absentees or Caribbean planters as sort of hedonists that only they drink to excess and without reason. And they do drink a lot. I'm not going to say that that's not true. However, it's one of the ways that this sort of very conglomerate society of English, Irish, Huguenot, Jewish, French people is able to kind of reach across these sort of differences in a sense, and at least have a shared language of politics and social interaction that involves alcohol. It doesn't mean that there isn't violence and disputes, and it doesn't kind of smooth things over to that extent, but at least there's a way that politics can function, even if it is different from how they function in the British mainland. That I think ultimately the proof is in the fact that the Leeward Islands become some of the richest sugar plantations in the British Empire by the mid-18th century. I think the sort of lack of functioning in the way that alcohol makes people indolent and less productive is obviously most of the people laboring are enslaved, right? Most of the planters aren't doing very much actual work. But in terms of running a political and social world, I do think alcohol is important and not only a distraction.
Wonderful, thank you, Lila. Phil's again in the question box. He's saying the anecdote about alcohol-induced is fascinating. He was wondering about alcohol as a bundle comestible, as it's often described. What was it consumed with, including other intoxicants such as tobacco, and did this change over time?
Sorry, my heat just clanged. Would you mind repeating part of that question?
Cool.
Sorry.
Fascinated by the anecdote about alcohol in juice, and was wondering about the status of alcohol as a so-called bundle comestible. Mm-hmm. What was it consumed with, including other intoxicants such as tobacco, and did this change over time?
So yes, tobacco definitely. The Kalinago would consume it with tobacco at times, although it didn't come up as much as I thought it would with them. Often you see it presented with, in the context of tobacco with the planters as well. That is an important performance of politics. With the conspiracy, apart from Gravedirt and Cocksblood, one of the kind of striking things to me about reading the transcriptions of the witness statements is the degree to which they focus on the details of the food. I mean, it's like reading a George R.R. Martin novel. Like, it's every sort of detail of pie, what type of roast fowl they were eating, what type of fruit was served. It's all detailed out. And I think, and then the witness, the accused would sometimes come back and say, oh no, we only had 2 pies, not 5. And they weren't apple, they were, plantain. And so therefore this is not as costly a feast. So, don't focus on us. And I think that kind of focus on the other consumables around alcohol was kind of meant to suggest, the focus on it was to see how much of a transgression these gatherings were. If the enslaved people were eating sort of more low cost or things they could have grown themselves, their suggestion that they were not engaging then in the illicit economy, they didn't have this sort of unseen by white society network of way of gathering more costly products. And so then as a defensive mechanism, enslaved people would say, no, we didn't have access to these sorts of things. So the contest over which food went with the rum, and one of the other components of the trials is the type and variety of alcohol also comes up a few times. So rum is almost always there, but there's discussion over the types of wine, if there's beer, if there's not beer. I mean, if you're interested in just Caribbean foodways, they're actually a very good source.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lila. Well, the witching hour cometh, so I think we're going to have to wrap things up here. But it remains me to say thanks to you all for coming, and especially huge thanks to Lila for a fascinating talk. Very best of luck for the final stretch of the thesis, which we all can't wait to read. Our next seminar is in 2 weeks' time. At the same time, when Elizabeth Grass from the University of Oxford will be speaking on tea, empire, and the country house. Do register on our website if you haven't already. I've just put a little link to the seminar schedule at the bottom of the page. So thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.